Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. That the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Pearl Harbor came as a complete shock to some, but an inevitable reality for others, with this surprise attack marking the United States' entry into the deadliest war in human history, in which over 50 million people would perish across the globe. But why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? What were their motivations, and how did they manage to catch the Americans so off guard, with their attack on Pearl Harbor becoming the deadliest attack on US territory until the events of 9/11? For the United States, a series of decisions made by both Roosevelt himself and others in the State Department were instrumental in bringing about Japan's attack, with often well-intentioned policies aimed at stopping the spread of the Japanese Empire in Asia, ultimately bringing war upon their own soldiers stationed overseas. To understand the real reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the video will be split into 4 distinct chapters, each highlighting the key reasons as to why it occurred. The first chapter will highlight Japan's rapid transformation from an isolated country at the time of the samurai into a modern industrial power, one that became so powerful in such a short time that it could even rival the great colonial nations of the West. Having modernized the nation during the Meiji Restoration, Chapter 2 will discuss what they did with this newfound wealth and power, taking you step by step through Japan's wars of conquest in East Asia, which, ultimately, put them on the roads to war with the United States. This chapter will also explore the challenges Japan faced during the early 20th century, as it tackled a growing empire and suffered under the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. Ultimately, this would lead to the growth of fanaticism and the concentration of military power across Japanese society, making a conflict with the West all but inevitable. The third chapter will take you step by step through the negotiations between Japan and the United States, so you can hear what each side said in their own words during the critical months leading up to Pearl Harbor. We will also explore how leaders on both sides managed the situation, the compromises they reached, and finally, the real reasons why negotiations broke down. In the last and final chapter, we will take you through the assault on Pearl Harbor itself, including the detailed plans of Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, and why he chose this base on the island chain of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific as the primary target for his attack. Join us as we take you step by step and chapter by chapter through the actual reasons Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and how the United States was drawn into the most deadly conflict in human history. Japan, an island nation on the edge of the Asian continent, had never been the richest or most dominant nation in the region. Its mountainous terrain limited agriculture. It lacked the vital raw materials required for industrialization, and for centuries was ruled over by a series of warlords who kept Japan isolated from the rest of the world. So how was it that this island nation managed to conquer 20% of the world's population and go head-to-head against the world's rising superpower, the United States? Just a century before Pearl Harbor, Japan was an isolationist nation, with virtually no contact with the rest of the world, but that was soon to change. In the late 18th century, Great Britain had become the first nation in the world to industrialize, with its steam engine, power looms, and the mass production of steel, revolutionizing the fields of transportation, manufacturing, and warfare. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had swept across Western Europe, with the new wealth and technology they now possessed fueling the rapid expansion of colonial empires across the globe. What would emerge would now be a growing divide between these Western superpowers and the rest of the world, with traditional societies like the Japanese suddenly unable to defend themselves in the face of such an overwhelming technological gap. Japan, ruled over by a series of powerful warlords known as shogun, had kept the country almost completely isolated for centuries, with only limited forms of trade happening with the Chinese and Dutch. But in 1852, American President Millard Fillmore, wanting to expand trade in the East, would send 4 armed steel warships to the shores of Japan, demanding that their ports be opened to American ships and that the United States be given a permanent diplomatic presence in the country. Under the command of Commodore Matthew C. Perry, the American ships would enter Edo Bay, Japan's principal harbour, with their sheer size, advanced weaponry and ability to move under their own power, far beyond anything Japan had seen before, sparking fear and anxiety throughout the nation. The Japanese would refer to these ships as Korofune, or Black Ships, with their arrival symbolising the end of Japan's 200-year-old policy of sakoku, or seclusion. Being forced to accept these American terms under the threat of violence, the Japanese agreed to open its ports and were made to sign a series of unequal treaties that benefited the US to their own detriment. Japan was powerless. All they could do was accept the terms, with them having no feasible way of defeating a country with such advanced technology. The realities of globalization, however, would not just hit Japan, with China providing a warning to all nations in the East of what was to happen if they failed to modernize and accept the realities of the new world they now found themselves in. The cultural and economic center of the Asian world for the past 2,000 years, China was entering a period of total chaos, plagued by a series of devastating civil wars, with the Taiping Rebellion alone leading to the deaths of nearly 30 million people. The ruling Qing dynasty was slowly losing its grip on power, with the nation becoming increasingly destabilized. Seeing this, industrial powers from the West would look to exploit China's weakened state. The British East India Company, wanting to sell more goods in the East, flooded China with opium, causing widespread addiction across the Chinese population. When the Qing government attempted to halt this trade, however, Britain, along with France, waged 2 wars to protect their economic interests, both of which China would lose. These conflicts, known as the Opium Wars, demonstrated to the East for the first time the overwhelming technological and military advantages of the industrialized European powers. As a result, the Chinese, just like Japan, were forced to sign a series of unequal treaties that not only now legalized opium across the country, but also granted Western powers favorable trade concessions, reparations, and territorial rights, with Hong Kong being handed over to the British Empire, ushering in a period known to the Chinese as the Century of Humiliation. Not only this, but to the north, Russia too would look to capitalize upon China's weakness, securing significant territorial gains at their expense, including a 3,000-mile stretch of coastline along the Pacific Ocean, establishing Russia as a major power in Asia and a dominant force in the Pacific. For the Japanese, the Americans had landed on their shores, the European powers were dictating terms to China, and Russia was gaining massive swathes of territory in the north. It was clear, if they were to protect themselves and find their place in this new global order, Japan needed to study what had made the West so powerful. For the Japanese, China would also provide an example of what not to do when facing the threats of the new industrialized world. Viewing Western civilization as barbaric and their own culture as superior, China's leaders underestimated the danger they now faced, and instead of trying to understand their enemy, simply employed the same military techniques they had done for centuries. As author Sarah C. Payne describes it, Chinese elites' pervasive contempt for foreigners had discouraged the study of the West. They failed to appreciate the unprecedented nature of the threat, let alone the need to counter with an unprecedented strategy. The Chinese assumed what had functioned so well in the past would do so in the future. They were wrong. Watching these events unfold in China and wanting to avoid the same mistakes, Japanese leaders began a serious effort to study the West, hoping to understand what made these new world powers so successful, so that they could emulate it for themselves. The study of the West began in 1857, which initially saw the mass translation of Western books into Japanese, and then accelerated when students were sent abroad to study Western law, science, navigation, and medicine. What would result would be a new generation of reformers, ready to bring Japan into the industrial age. But if any serious change was to happen, then Japan's military overlords, the shogun, a symbol of tradition and stagnation, would have to be abolished. The shogunate's power and status had been seriously weakened following its inability to respond to Matthew Perry's black ships and the unequal treaties that followed, with a revolution to overthrow their rule beginning in 1868, known as the Boshin War. After a decisive defeat at the Battle of Toba-Fushimi, Japan's last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, would resign, with the shogunate system officially coming to an end. In his place, the reformers would put 15-year-old Emperor Meiji in charge of the country, who would serve as a legitimizer of their new regime. Becoming known as the Meiji Reformers, this new government would implement a series of sweeping reforms aimed at the rapid modernization of the country. Moving the capital from Kyoto to Edo, they would rename the city Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital, symbolizing a new era for Japan. Soon, the government was sending whole delegations of civil servants abroad, in which they would study a wide range of Western institutions, trying to learn as much of the New World as they could. The most renowned of these was the Iwakura mission, led by prominent Meiji reformer Iwakura Tomomi. This delegation of 50 statesmen and scholars embarked on a 2-year journey across 12 countries, including Britain and the United States, where they met with influential figures such as Queen Victoria and President Ulysses S. Grant. Studying a whole array of Western institutions and technological developments, the Iwakura mission would come to the conclusion that simply acquiring modern technology was not enough. To truly thrive, Japan needed to embrace the very foundations of Western power, their civil, economic, and political institutions. These, they realized, were the essential building blocks for a new and thriving Japanese society. Realizing that rapid modernization required an educated population, the Meiji reformers would make elementary education compulsory, as well as establishing Tokyo Imperial University just 14 years later. A British-style parliament was also introduced, the Diet, which would see a cabinet serve under a prime minister, with a modern civil service, westernized criminal code, and judicial system also being established. A new constitution was drafted in 1889, along with a whole array of economic reforms, with a central bank, the Bank of Japan, being founded in 1882, and Marunouchi, a thriving business district springing up in Tokyo, being nicknamed Little London due to its rows of red brick buildings. Soon, millions of people from across the nation would leave the countryside and flock to the cities, being employed in various commercial and industrial industries, with Tokyo becoming a modern-day metropolis, with its population doubling to 2.2 million people over the coming decades. These reforms, however, would come at a cost. The rapid shift towards a westernized society disrupted traditional ways of life, leading to discontent among many who felt their cultural identity was being eroded. As a result, the Meiji reformers would use Shinto, Japan's traditional religion, to help bridge the divide from the old to the new. Shinto beliefs held that the emperor was a divine figure, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The Meiji reformers, therefore, would use their emperor's divine and unquestioned status in order to legitimize the creation of their new government and the policies they would now enact. As he was a divine figure, the emperor demanded absolute loyalty from every Japanese citizen, and as he gave his blessing to the government, this would give them the authority to rule. Emperor Meiji and his successors would now be the social glue that held the fabric of Japanese society together, helping transform the nation from one of shogunate rulers to the new Western imperial system. However, these institutions would not be the only thing that Japanese leaders took from the West. They also recognized that nearly all the great powers of the time had large empires, with significant militaries to support them, and believed that there was no reason that Japan should not have this too. In order to protect their interests and gain status as a regional power, therefore, the Meiji reformers believed that a Japanese empire would have to be created. Conscription would be introduced in 1873, with the Japanese army undergoing rapid modernization, drawing heavily on the Prussian model to forge a disciplined and structured fighting force. With the samurai, who had seen their place in society disappear with the end of the shogunate, finding their role once again by becoming the officers of the newly formed Imperial Japanese Army. The Navy too would undergo a massive transformation, as General Yamagata Aritomo would advocate. Japan was to become a floating fortress that was able to exercise power in all directions. As such, a new Japanese navy was to be established, based off the British Navy, the most powerful in the world at the time, with a large fleet of over 30 modern warships under Japan's control by the end of the century. What had begun as an agricultural society ruled over by shogunate warlords had now transformed itself into a new world power, with Western institutions, a thriving economy, and a military capable of defeating all those it fought against in the region. The balance of power in East Asia was about to undergo a radical transformation. The path to war with the United States had now begun. The instability China's civil wars had ushered in, not only in China but across the region, had created a power vacuum in which another great power would look to fill its place. For the Japanese, who were now looking to establish a new empire across the Asian continent, this presented a promising opportunity. For centuries, Korea had been a tributary state to China, acknowledging its dominance in exchange for protection. Japan, however, would now seek to acquire control of Korea for themselves. Not only would it provide a perfect staging base for further military expansion into East Asia, but a decisive victory abroad would show those at home who were still resistant to the westernization of their country that the Meiji reforms were in fact working. Not only this, but Japanese control over Korea could help to stop Russian expansionism, who were also looking to capitalize upon China's weakness. In 1891, the Russian government decided to build the Trans-Siberian Railway, that would allow for the rapid transportation of troops into the east, facilitating the creation of a Russian empire in Asia, land that the Japanese had been keen to take for themselves. Securing Korea before the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway was therefore crucial for Japan. Allowing Russia to expand into the region would not only expose Japan to potential invasions from the mainland, but also hinder their ambitions for territorial expansion. Beginning the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, Japan invaded Korea, capturing Korean King Gojong and forcing him to install a puppet government subservient to Japanese interests. Defeating the Chinese in almost every battle, both at land and sea, Japan would secure a victory in just 8 months, taking Korea, the island of Formosa, as well as the Liaodong Peninsula. With this territory now under their control, Japan had made the first steps towards creating their new empire, establishing the nation as a rising power in Asia. Japan's success, however, would not be looked upon favourably by the Russians, whose own plans for an Asian empire were now under threat. As a result, Russia would leverage its relationships with Germany and France, with the three delivering an ultimatum known as the Triple Intervention, demanding, under the threat of force, that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, something they would reluctantly agree to. The Japanese would feel a deep sense of humiliation by the forced withdrawal, with nationalist sentiments and the desire for revenge growing throughout the nation. To make matters worse, Russia would seize the Liaodong Peninsula for themselves just 3 years later, a clear betrayal that signaled to the Japanese that the West, and in particular the Russians, could not be trusted. After so much progress had been made by the Meiji reformers, it was clear they were still not respected on the world stage, and something would have to be done. Japan would now embark on a massive military build-up. If the Western powers were to threaten them again, they would have the resources necessary to resist any foreign interference. With tensions growing between Japan and Russia, both powers would now look to the Chinese province of Manchuria as a target for expansion. For the Russians, the acquisition of land in the east was something the new Tsar, Nicholas II, believed could enhance his prestige and legitimize his rule. Seeking to assert their claim over Manchuria, Russia would begin to expand the Trans-Siberian Railway into the province, laying down 1,000 miles of track. For the Japanese, however, Manchuria wasn't just a vanity project aimed to legitimize the rule of a new leader. For them, it was an absolute necessity to their national survival. Not only was it a gateway to the rest of Asia, but it was also rich in resources such as coal, iron, and lumber, which were essential for industrialization and further military expansion. However, unknown to both parties at the time, it would yet again be developments in China that would cause turmoil across the region. Resenting their treatment at the hands of the Western powers, a group of Chinese rebels known as the Boxers would stage an uprising aimed at expelling the so-called foreign devils that they saw as destroying their country. As part of their rebellion, however, the Boxers would target Russia's newly built and highly expensive railway line in Manchuria, destroying much of the work that had already been done. In response, the Russians would launch a full-scale invasion of the province in 1900, completely occupying Manchuria in order to protect their interests. For the Japanese, this was the worst-case scenario and a complete disaster, with Russia having taken over the land they had been so keen to take for themselves. As the years went on, and with the Russians refusing to withdraw, Japanese leadership would see no other option but to break off all diplomatic ties with Russia in 1904. The only way to secure control over Manchuria would now be by force. Launching a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, it would mark the beginning of what would later be known as the Russo-Japanese War. What would follow would be a series of battles across Korea and Manchuria, with each side sustaining heavy casualties throughout the coming months. Sending reinforcements, and with the British denying them passage through the Suez Canal, the Russian fleet would be forced to sail around the coast of Africa, and by the time they arrived in the Pacific in 1905, the Japanese fleet was waiting for them. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commanding the Japanese forces, would manage to achieve a decisive victory at the Battle of Tsushima, annihilating the entire Russian fleet, and with it, any hopes of their victory. For one young Japanese officer, Isoroku Yamamoto, the Battle of Tsushima would be a defining moment. The 21-year-old, who would later mastermind the attack on Pearl Harbor, saw firsthand the devastating consequences of Japan's initial surprise attack against the Russian fleet, from which they never fully recovered. This victory, achieved against a much larger power, showed the effectiveness of such tactics, a lesson Yamamoto would revisit decades later when he was tasked with formulating a plan to attack the United States. Completely humiliated, Russian morale would collapse overnight, with Tsar Nicholas being forced to sign the Treaty of Portsmouth, granting Japan the southern half of Sakhalin Island, as well as control of the southern half of Manchuria that not only included its mineral-rich land, but also the prized Russian railway the Tsar had exerted so much effort to keep. Japan's militarization had worked. They had fought a great European power and won, gained the territory that they had hoped for, and solidified Japan, rather than Russia, as the new dominant power in Asia. Not only this, but their victory would mark the first time an Asian power would defeat a European nation in the modern age, a defining moment that marked the rise of Japanese supremacy in the East. Having established themselves as a rising power on the world stage, the Japanese were now beginning to be taken seriously by the industrialized great powers of the West, and would further enhance their prestige by fighting alongside the Allied forces during the First World War. Doing so would allow them to seize and occupy German colonial possessions across the region, with China's Shandong province, as well as several island chains in the Central Pacific, the Marianas, the Marshalls, and the Carolinas, all coming under Japanese control. However, despite their best efforts to be seen as equals on the international stage, it was still apparent to many Japanese that they were looked down upon as inferior by the Western powers. During the Versailles peace talks after the war, Japan's attempts to introduce a racial equality clause were shut down by the imperial powers, as the clause would have undermined their justifications for colonial rule. Not only this, but 6 years later in 1924, an American law was passed preventing immigration from Asia, effectively banning all Japanese migration to the United States. This law would leave no doubt in Japanese minds that they were subject to discriminatory treatment by the West, and it made clear that they would never be seen as equal partners. From the American perspective, Japan's successful imperial conquests in Asia was a threat to both their security and economic interests in the region. Following their victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States had established itself as a major power in the Pacific, gaining control over the former Spanish colonies of Guam and the Philippines. To safeguard its newfound strategic and economic interests in the region, the United States adopted an open-door policy towards China, aimed at protecting Chinese sovereignty. As China represented the biggest potential market in the East, making sure this market remained open would be one of America's top priorities. To achieve this, they would look to implement a series of treaties to prevent any one nation, and in particular Japan, from taking over the region. In these treaties, the United States, Japan, and a number of other European powers placed limitations on the number of battleships and battle cruisers each nation could possess, prohibited the construction of new military bases in the Pacific, agreed to not invade one another's territories, and most importantly, that all nations involved would uphold China's territorial sovereignty and grant each other equal access to the Chinese market. However, as a result of these treaties, Japan had been forced to return the Shandong province to China, a prize they had only just gained due to their participation during World War I. Acceptance of these terms would spark outrage amongst Japanese nationalists, who saw these treaties as yet another example of unwanted Western interference. As a result, they decided to take action into their own hands, assassinating Japanese Prime Minister Takashi Hara, the most prominent advocate of the new treaties. This assassination marked a growing rise in Japanese nationalism, with hardline militarists coming to play an increasingly important role as Japan transitioned into the modern era. Although Japan had transitioned away from the shogunate system of the 19th century, the militaristic culture it left behind remained deeply ingrained within Japanese society. The Meiji generation, who had ushered in Western-style government, were now reaching the end of their lives, with the idea that the military be subordinates to the government fading away with them. With their passing and Japan's many imperial victories across Asia and the Pacific, a growing nationalist sentiment would emerge in their place, with the military gaining ever more fame, prestige, and public support. For the politicians who worked to steer Japan through international politics, they were beginning to face growing public disapproval with every Western demand that they capitulated to, with each being perceived as a national humiliation, eroding their public image and fueling discontent. As such, the void the Meiji generation had left in government would soon be filled with fanatical militarists, and by the early 1920s, the military had gained enough power to bypass the Prime Minister completely, pledging their allegiance only to the Emperor himself. The system that would emerge would come to be known as State Shinto, where a strong centralized government under the leadership of a divine emperor was used to justify militaristic expansion. A key figure in the development of Shinto ultranationalism was political philosopher Uesugi Shinkichi, who argued that Japan, as the embodiment of divine will, had not only a right but a duty to spread its superior culture and civilization to other parts of Asia. It was an ideology that was to take grip of Japan's ruling military elite, coming to full fruition under the reign of Emperor Hirohito, the grandson of Emperor Meiji, who ascended to the throne in 1926. Little did Hirohito know that as soon as he came to power, Japan would be thrust into a new age, one marked by a rapid transformation of its economy, culture, and military. Changes just as big as his grandfather, Emperor Meiji, had faced all those years ago. In 1929, the New York Stock Exchange, the largest in the world, was hit with a stock market crash, losing 90% of its value over the next 3 years. Alongside this, people began to lose faith in the entire financial system, looking to withdraw their deposits. As a result, a run on the banks occurred, and when the majority of their customers came to withdraw their funds, the banks collapsed, wiping out nearly a third of the money supply and people's savings across the nation. In 1930, in an attempt to rekindle the economy, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that taxed foreign imports when they entered the United States. However, instead of alleviating the situation, what resulted was an all-out global trade war, with high taxes being placed on American goods around the world in retaliation. As a result, American exports tanked and unemployment rose to nearly 25%, with factories, farms, and other industries now laying off workers as there was dwindling demand for their products. Soon, this international trade war that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had started had turned into a global depression. With high unemployment, widespread poverty, and the destruction of industry affecting nearly every country on the planet. Japan would be hit especially hard as its economy revolved around exporting goods to the United States and other foreign nations. With these foreign markets having now disappeared, Japanese exports were cut in half almost overnight, with rising unemployment and social unrest emerging across the country. Japan's silk industry, one of its principal exports to the United States, dropped by almost 80%, causing widespread hardship across the countryside, with protests and demonstrations against the government becoming the norm. Many felt betrayed by their leaders and increasingly looked to the military for solutions. Much like in Germany, where the economic turmoil of the Weimar Republic had led to the rise of authoritarian leadership, who promised salvation through territorial expansion, the same would now occur in Japan. The military would use the economic crisis to further bolster their position, advocating that it was vital that Japan secure more resources and territory in Asia in order to become economically self-sufficient. To free themselves from the reliance on Western trade, they argued, they would need to conquer new territory, with the people in this land providing them with new markets to export their products to, as well as the raw materials needed to fuel their industry. As they had done in the past, the target for this expansion would be in China, with Japanese militarists now looking to complete their takeover of the resource-rich province of Manchuria. This target, however, would set them on the path of no return. From here on out, the road to the Second World War had begun. With economic turmoil gripping the country and extreme politics on the rise, many would now turn to the military's policy of territorial expansion as a way to secure the necessary resources and markets needed to alleviate Japan's domestic situation. Soon, a number of secret organizations would emerge throughout the military, comprised of junior officers who had been completely indoctrinated in the tenets of state Shinto, believing in Japan's racial and cultural superiority over the other peoples of Asia, and saw a policy of aggressive expansionism as the only route to their nation's prosperity. Known collectively as the Young Officers, they would follow in a centuries-old Japanese tradition known as Geikokujo, in which junior officers would frequently disobey the orders handed down to them, and instead take matters into their own hands. Such ideas had infiltrated Japan's force stationed in southern Manchuria, known as the Kwantan Army, with many coming to believe that their superiors were being too slow to act, and that an immediate takeover of the entirety of Manchuria, along with the wealth of materials it contained, was the only way to ensure Japan's prosperity. And so, on the evening of September 18th, 1931, Japanese Kwantan soldiers would blow up a section of their own South Manchurian railway, which served as a vital transportation route for resources and troops in the province. Falsely blaming the incident on the Chinese rebels, the Kwantan Army would use it as an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. Although the Japanese government opposed the attack, there was little they could do, as the Kwantan officers simply ignored their demands to stop the assault, with the politicians ultimately having to give the campaign their blessing in order to save face and make it seem like they were still in control. Completing the occupation of Manchuria by the start of 1932, the Japanese would rename the region Manchukuo, a puppet state that would now serve their interests. The attack would be seen as an unacceptable act of Japanese aggression in the West, with the League of Nations, a new international peacekeeping organization founded after World War I, responding to Chinese pleas for help by demanding Japan's withdrawal from the region. However, the United States at this point was still not a member of the League, with their absence meaning that the institution lacked the military power and political influence needed to have a significant effect upon Japan's actions. As a result, Japan simply refused to comply with the League's suggestions and left the institution in 1933.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese delegates refused to accept the decision and sensationally walk out of the Assembly. A fateful step.
With this act, Japan had further isolated itself from international politics, with the weakness the League of Nations had displayed emboldening them to pursue even more military conquests. Having secured their interests in Manchuria, the young officers would come to play an increasingly significant role over the coming years, launching a wave of political assassinations that would forever change Japan, killing prime ministers, business leaders, and any who they saw as holding Japan back from a policy of unrestricted military expansion. As one of the young officers would state when on trial for the murder of Prime Minister Inukai Kiyoshi, the imperial way should be spread through the world, the Asiatic nations being first consolidated into a unit, and thereafter the rest of the world. The military's grip on Japan had been secured. From here on out, they would be the ones that would decide the fate of the nation. By 1937, the military's control over Japan was absolute. The government was packed with Shinto loyalists, and their invasion of Manchuria had been an unprecedented success. Heavily investing in infrastructure, the Japanese would rapidly expand the railway and road systems across their newly formed puppet state, invest in education, and poured money into the development of heavy industry that would provide the raw materials needed to sustain their empire. By 1943, Japan had transformed Manchuria from an impoverished agricultural society, plagued by civil wars, into an economic powerhouse, with their newly founded puppet state producing 50% of all Chinese coal, 78% of its electricity, 87% of its pig iron, 93% of its steel, 66% of its concrete, and 99% of its oil. By 1945, it had a per capita income 50% higher than the rest of China, and had become the most industrialized part of Asia outside the Japanese home islands, outproducing even Shanghai and the Yangtze River Valley, long the heart of China's modern economy. Such a success was not overlooked by Japan's ruling military elite, who would take this as a confirmation that their plan to revive Japan's economy through conquest was in fact correct, and that further expansion into China was now required if they were to continue to fuel their growing empire. The opportunity to do so would present itself in July 1937, when a seemingly minor border clash known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident ignited a full-scale war between China and Japan. Japanese commanders believed that the conflict would be resolved within a matter of months, expecting that the Chinese, as they had done during the invasion of Manchuria, would quickly come to a settlement rather than risk all-out war. The Chinese, however, had come to see the Japanese as an existential threat to the survival of their country, who would not stop until the entirety of China came under their control. Agreeing to halt the civil war that had plagued China for the last 10 years, the leaders of the nation's two most significant parties, Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang and Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party, would put aside their differences to form a united front against Japan. With them now united into one force, the Japanese would face more resistance than they ever had before, with Japan committing over 600,000 men by the end of 1937, with the number soon rising to over 1 million men just a year later. The conflict, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, would become the central focus for Japan over the next 8 years, only coming to an end with Japan's defeat at the end of the Second World War. By the end of 1937, in just 6 months, Japanese forces had managed to take nearly all of China's major cities, with them then marching west from Shanghai towards the city of Nanking. Here, however, the Japanese would put their fanaticism on full display, committing one of the most brutal acts in the history of warfare. By December, 50,000 Japanese troops had reached the city, who would participate in the destruction, widespread slaughter, rape, and murder of innocent civilians. 300,000 lives, half of the city's population, would be taken in less than 6 weeks, most being buried in mass graves with their hands tied behind their backs. Further atrocities would follow, with the Japanese setting up mobile brothels and kidnapping women from China and Korea, who would be forced against their will to serve the needs of the Japanese soldiers. Up to 400,000 of what would later be known as comfort women are estimated to have been taken into captivity, with the news of such atrocities quickly reaching the West. In America, reports of Japanese brutality would cause widespread condemnation, with Congress ultimately choosing to provide China with loans, arms, and supplies to help in their struggle against Japan and to maintain their open-door policy in the region. For American leaders, although they wished to avoid a direct war with Japan for the time being, there was now no question that they were to be viewed as an enemy, not just to America itself, but to the international order they were trying to uphold. By 1939, the Japanese occupied 1/3 of China, with most of its modern industry, raw materials, railroads, and cities now directly under their control. But despite their rapid conquest of the region, they had embarked on a campaign that was simply far more difficult than anything they had imagined. Bogged down in the countryside, they faced fierce resistance from Chinese forces who had adopted guerrilla warfare tactics, sabotaging infrastructure and ambushing patrols to harass and exhaust their opponents. A campaign that some Japanese generals thought would take only months to complete had now turned into a war of attrition, with the Japanese suffering almost 600,000 casualties in China before their attack on Pearl Harbor, causing growing discontent amongst the Japanese population, who saw a whole generation of their young men shipped overseas to fight in a conflict that never seems to end. Not only this, but this war of expansion was quickly becoming the biggest financial drain upon the entire Japanese economy. By 1941, military expenditures accounted for nearly 80% of government spending, leaving no room for the production of consumer goods, causing wages and the standard of living to collapse across the nation. Rather than reducing reliance on Western imports, as had been the original objective of the military, their territorial expansion, which required vast sums of fuel for planes, ships, and transports, would drastically increase their reliance on imported oil, rising from 67% in 1935 all the way up to 90% in 1939. This would be Japan's biggest vulnerability. If their war in Asia was to continue, their supply of oil could not be disrupted. Although the situation was rapidly deteriorating for the Japanese, events across the other side of the globe would soon change the situation altogether. Over in Europe, the Second World War had broken out on the continent, with the British, French, and Dutch fighting for survival against Hitler's Germany. For Japan, this presented a promising opportunity. With these Western nations preoccupied in Europe, the colonies they possessed in Asia and the Pacific would now be ripe for the taking. Colonies that would not only be easier to conquer than China, but that could provide the vital raw materials they needed, and give the Japanese civilian population a renewed sense that military victory was around the corner. Assuming power in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR, inherited a nation grappling with the Great Depression and growing international tensions. His popularity was immense, riding a wave of optimism and a mandate for change, with him serving a historic 4 terms in office, 2 more than any other president in history.
Thousands of Americans are here to cheer the birth of a new era in national affairs, a New Deal era, which is supposed to pull the country out of its chaos.
In foreign policy, Roosevelt initially emphasized a good neighbor policy with Latin America, seeking to improve relations by reducing US interventionism in the region. In Japan too, he would take a similar approach, mirroring the policy of his predecessor, President Herbert Hoover, who had refused to directly intervene when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. However, as Japanese conquests across the region continued, Roosevelt came to believe that American intervention was warranted, initially adopting a policy of moral condemnation and refusing to recognize the puppet state of Manchu Kuo. However, as time went on, Roosevelt's intervention in the region grew and grew, with him beginning to send money, arms, and other aid directly into China to assist in their fight against the Japanese. With the Dutch and French having now been conquered by Hitler's Germany, Japan would look to take advantage of their defenseless colonies in East Asia, with French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies being their first targets of the region. From the Dutch, they would demand greater access to their oil and other raw material exports from the East Indies, and from the British and French, they would demand that the supply lines from both Indochina and Burma be closed off to stem the flow of aid to China. These actions, however, would cause growing concern in the United States, with President Roosevelt signing the Export Control Act in July 1940, restricting exports of aviation fuel, steel, and scrap iron to Japan. This embargo, Roosevelt believed, would be a stern warning to the Japanese and would be a way to curb their aggression without resorting to direct military intervention. However, far from deterring the Japanese, These actions drove them into the arms of Germany and Italy, with the three signing the Tripartite Pact in September 1940. This agreement stipulated that they would assist each other with all political, economic, and military means if one of them was attacked by a nation not yet involved in either the war in Europe or China. It was effectively a direct threat to the United States, warning them that if they took military action against the Japanese, they would be declaring war on the combined forces of Italy, Germany, and Japan. As the Japanese foreign minister would state, the pact would force the United States to act more prudently in carrying out her plans against Japan. While the Japanese believed they had crafted a plan that would lead to peace, for the British and Americans, by Japan signing the pact, they were now viewed as no better than their new allies, Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, with these three nations seen as little more than a group of aggressor states that looked to conquer the world.
Germany had conquered half of Europe. Japan controlled a large part of China. Between Japan's leaders and Adolf Hitler, there was a perfect meeting of minds and a complete understanding.
This alliance, however, would soon present Japan with a promising opportunity. Hitler's declaration of war against the Soviet Union had placed Stalin in a vulnerable position. For the Japanese, they now had a difficult decision to make. Although they had recently signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, this was an unprecedented opportunity to take advantage of the Soviets' weakened state and to knock out their historic rival once and for all, guaranteeing Japanese superiority of continental Asia. Or they could continue with their planned conquest to the south, where the vital supplies of oil were located. The Japanese foreign minister Yosuke Matsuoka was convinced that the Germans would quickly defeat Russia, and that they should at once coordinate a two-pronged attack with Hitler. As he would state, "When Germany wipes out the Soviet Union, we can't simply share in the spoils of victory unless we've done something." Hideki Tojo, the war minister, was hesitant, however. "If we declare war on the Russians, would the United States back them up and declare war on us?" After much debate and wanting to avoid a two-pronged war, they decided to forego the opportunity to attack the Soviets and agreed that the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia should be their top priority. As Kenyo Sato, a prominent military officer, stated, "We gain nothing in the north, at least we get oil and other resources in the south." With the support of Germany and Italy now secured and the pact with Russia intact, Japan would be emboldened to continue their conquests in Asia, with French Indochina becoming their next target. With France defeated and England battling for its own existence, Indochina, with its rubber, tin, tungsten, coal and rice, was to them a treasure lying in the streets just waiting to be picked up. And so, in July 1941, they would deliver an ultimatum to the Vichy French government, declaring that they would march into their colony of Indochina, with or without their blessing. With no other option, the French would concede, allowing Japanese troops to enter the country on July 24th. It was a significant victory, with the Japanese ambassador in France messaging Tokyo. The reason why the French so readily accepted the Japanese demands was that they saw how resolute was our determination, and how swift our will. In short, they had no choice but to yield. This time, however, Japan's actions would provoke a more serious response from the West. From America's perspective, Japan's takeover of French Indochina was a clear sign that their dreams of empire were far greater than just Manchuria and China, and it was something they would now have to stop. As such, President Roosevelt, with the backing of the British and Dutch, would freeze all Japanese assets, halt all trade, as well as enforce a complete embargo of all oil exports to the nation. As Japan imported almost 90% of its oil and had no natural reserves of their own, this embargo threatened to completely cripple both their economy and ability to wage war. At current rates of consumption, they would have at best a year-and-a-half supply of oil left, giving them a definitive point at which their empire would begin to collapse. As the New York Times put it on July 26, it was the most drastic blow, short of actual war. Roosevelt knew the risks, and he had been warned by the Navy War Plans Division that the embargo would probably result in a fairly early attack by Japan on Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, and possibly involve the United States in an early war in the Pacific. Despite this, for Roosevelt, the potential to halt Japanese conquests before they got out of hand was too great an opportunity to pass. For the Japanese, however, the American embargo was viewed as an unacceptable and hypocritical act of aggression. Japan had gained the territory without firing a single shot, and had completed the takeover within the realm of international law. To them, their occupation was nothing worse than what the British or Americans had done with their own colonies, with this embargo signalling the final step in the encirclement of their empire by what they called the ABCD, the four hostile powers of America, Britain, China, and the Dutch. With their supply of oil now completely cut off, Japanese leaders were left with very few options. The first would be to abandon their plans for Southeast Asia completely and retreat all the way back to Japan, giving Russia and China control of the region. Alternatively, they could work out a compromise with the West in exchange for the resumption of oil imports. Or, if that failed, the last resort would be to attack the British and Dutch colonies and take the resources they needed by force. With the first option thought of as completely unacceptable by the entire Japanese government, they would first pursue a diplomatic solution with the West. With the diplomatic solution now to be pursued, the task would be up to Japan's new Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoye, who had taken power in July 1940. Born into one of Japan's most influential aristocratic families, and a close personal friend of Emperor Hirohito, Konoye found support across all aspects of Japanese society, being described as a man of such wide interests and objectivity that he could listen with sympathy to those of all political beliefs. In fact, he listened with such sympathy that each in turn thought the prince agreed with him. However, Konoye's willingness to accept a wide range of political views would not only be his greatest strength, but also his greatest flaw, with his ability to hold seemingly opposite viewpoints on the same topic, making his own political beliefs difficult to discern, and something others would look to take advantage of. Konoye was a supporter of Japan's imperial conquests, sharing the view with the military that Japan should be, unquestionably, the major uncontested power of East Asia. He would also have a growing interest in the ideological tenets of fascism, particularly its emphasis on national unity and strong leadership, with him often willing to concede to the ideas of strong-willed militarists. Where he differed from the military, however, was that he believed war with the United States would almost certainly prevent them from achieving the empire they all looked to create. If war was to break out, Konoye believed that there was little chance of overcoming America's industrial potential. Not only this, but Konoye was also a student of the prominent reformer Saionji Kinmochi, the last surviving statesman of the Meiji generation. Saionji warned that it was essential to cooperate with Britain and America if Japan was to thrive, with Konoye following in his mentor's footsteps by prioritizing a diplomatic solution to the oil embargo crisis with the West. As such, despite his many contradictions, Konoye was viewed by most, including the Emperor himself, as the best chance Japan had at avoiding war. If he was to succeed, however, Konoye would have to overcome a significant obstacle: the military's uncontested power. The very structure of the Japanese government had ensured that none could oppose them, which would make his negotiations with the United States nearly impossible. At the head of the government was the Emperor, a divine figure whose seal was needed in order to officiate policy. To the Japanese, the Emperor was a living god, the father to the nation, to whom they would all pledge to serve to the death. None in the country, except for the most high-ranking generals and government officials, had ever heard his voice, with children taught that they would go blind if they were ever to look directly at his face. Emperor Hirohito, just like Konoye, was a student of the liberal reformer Prince Saionji Kinmochi, and as such was generally against the idea of a full-scale war with the United States. Having travelled to the West himself, Hirohito feared that Japan would be unable to win against the industrial power of America, and would therefore attempt to guide his government away from the path of conflict. However, despite his wishes to avoid war, Hirohito's ability to do so would be extremely limited, with tradition dictating that he was unable to oppose a policy once it had been decided upon by members of the government and military. Acting simply as a figurehead, he would be presented with these policies at imperial conferences, where he was expected to remain silent and rubber stamp whatever was put before him. Not only this, but Japan would operate under a unique dual government system that divided power between civilian and military authorities, both of which were answerable only to the Emperor himself. Crucially, as the military had an entirely separate chain of command, It meant that neither the Prime Minister nor any in the civilian government had any direct control over them, allowing the military to use their direct access to the Emperor in order to force through advantageous policies without any interference. Not only this, but the Supreme Command would have the power to veto any cabinet decision that they believed infringed upon military affairs, leaving the government virtually powerless to oppose them. With this power, they would be able to pursue their ultimate goal of a Japanese empire that dominated Asia and the Pacific. Kanye, as head of the civilian government, would therefore have the difficult task of not only reaching a diplomatic compromise with the United States, but also keeping the military happy so they did not interfere with negotiations. In an attempt to keep the military in check, Kanye would appoint a new war minister, Hideki Tojo, a general in the Imperial Army who was well known and respected amongst the military ranks for achieving a number of impressive victories within China. A man of extreme conviction, Tojo was known to never waver on his ideals, with him demanding absolute discipline from his subordinates. As such, although he believed fully in Japan's divine right of conquest, he had no tolerance for the rebellious young officers who he saw as disgracing the nation. By appointing Tojo, Kanye hoped he would be able to keep these rogue members of the army in check, and finally help bring about some much-needed discipline and order that would be crucial if negotiations were to go well with the United States. To begin negotiations, Kanye would first seek the military's permission to open diplomatic channels with the West. Despite harbouring doubts that they would lead to anything of substance, the military would ultimately agree, although they would put a hard deadline on negotiations, October 10th, 1941, just 2 months away. If he had not reached a settlement by this date, they would resort to armed conflict. With time now of the essence, Kanye believed that a personal meeting with Roosevelt was the only way he could resolve the two countries' many differences and come to an agreement before the army's deadline. If the president still does not see reason, I shall, of course, be fully prepared to break off the talks and return home, Kanye told Tojo and Navy Minister Okawa. He believed negotiations were the best path forward, and that both nations would have to make concessions if war was to be averted. And so, Kanye would send a message on August 7th to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, requesting that he be given an audience with Roosevelt to discuss resolving the differences between both countries. Hull, however, took a hardline approach towards the Japanese and believed that any sign of weakness on America's part would only encourage their plans for territorial expansion. A long-time advocate for free trade and international cooperation, Hull believed that the promotion of these ideas would promote economic interdependence and discourage nations from resorting to conflict. However, the rise of aggressive regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan posed a significant challenge to Hull's vision of a peaceful and interconnected world, with him being increasingly distrustful of the Japanese, who he saw as negotiating in bad faith, with their only goal to delay Western interference in their conquests.
The specter of a new descent into the conditions of international anarchy which characterized the Dark Ages looms on the horizon today. Our own nation, powerful as it is, and determined as it is to remain at peace, to preserve its cherished institutions, and to promote the welfare of its citizens, is not secure against that menace.
With both Roosevelt and Hull coming to see a conflict with Japan ever more likely, the president came to hold two opposing but pragmatic viewpoints: the want to settle negotiations diplomatically, but also bide time to strengthen their Pacific fleet if negotiations fell through. As Roosevelt would state to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1941, "If negotiations with Japan failed, at the very least, I think I can baby them along for 3 months." It was a risky policy, but if diplomacy failed, it would hopefully buy them just enough time to prepare for a conflict if one was to occur. With these objectives in mind, Hull, upon receiving Kanye's proposal, was extremely cautious, believing that much like Hitler had done to Chamberlain in Munich, it was simply a ruse, a bid to buy time, and they had no intention of keeping their word. As such, Hull responded that it remained with the Japanese government to decide whether it could find means of shaping its policies accordingly, and then endeavour to evolve some satisfactory plan. Hull was essentially dismissing Kanye's proposal outright, and was effectively stating that no official meeting could take place until Japan agreed to significant concessions. For the military, agreeing to contact the Americans at all was a significant concession, with Hull's dismissal causing growing suspicion amongst Japanese leaders. It appeared to them that rather than a genuine desire for peace, the Americans themselves were stalling for time. Time they could ill afford to lose, as each day 12,000 tons of irreplaceable oil was being consumed. Although Hull's response had stalled negotiations, Roosevelt himself was open to the idea of meeting with Connye and stated that the United States would be prepared to reopen the unofficial preparatory discussions which were broken off in July, and every effort will then be made to select a time and place to exchange views. However, the date he suggested would be the middle of October, which, unknowingly, would be the exact deadline the military had given Connye. Back in Japan, many were beginning to have serious reservations over a full-scale war with America. Colonel Hideo Irakuro would meet with several military and political figures, urging that negotiations must succeed as America's industrial potential would result in a crushing Japanese defeat if a military conflict was to occur. He contrasted the alarming differences between American and Japanese war potential. In steel, he said the ratio was 20-1, oil more than 100-1, coal 10-1, planes 5-1, shipping 2-1, labor force 5-1. The overall potential was 10-1. At such odds, Japan could not possibly win, despite Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. Although not all would heed his words, many had become sympathetic to Iwakuro's arguments, with the Supreme Command capitulating and agreeing to allow major concessions if it meant war was to be averted. And so, on August 28th, 2 messages were sent to Roosevelt. The first would be from Connye, yet again requesting a meeting between himself and the president, with the second message officially declaring that they would withdraw all Japanese troops from French Indochina once the war with China had been resolved, promising to make no further military advances into neighbouring countries, and that they would respect the Soviet Union's borders as long as they did not attack Japanese assets in Manchukuo. Not only this, but they would also agree to abide by 4 basic principles outlined by Hull as essential if any negotiations were to take place. Number 1. Respect for the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of each and all nations. Number 2. Support of the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Number 3. Support of the principle of equality, including equality of commercial opportunity. Number 4. Non-disturbance of the status quo in the Pacific, except as the status quo may be altered by peaceful means. This was a drastic concession for the Japanese to make. Not only were they willing to negotiate on America's terms, but by agreeing to the point, the military would have to halt their plans for the expansion of the Japanese empire. Upon receiving the Japanese response, Roosevelt was initially enthusiastic. At long last, the 2 countries were beginning to come to a compromise, with the president drawing up plans to spend 3 much-needed days with Connye. However, not everyone was impressed. American codebreakers had managed to crack the Japanese diplomatic code, an operation they called Magic. This breakthrough granted US officials, including Secretary of State Hull, unprecedented access to the confidential communications of high-ranking Japanese officials, often knowing of their intentions, strategies, and negotiating positions before official meetings even took place. As such, Hull and others were usually dismissive of any direct correspondence or outreaches by the Japanese government, often coming to conclusions based on these magic reports alone. Accompanying the latest Japanese proposals were new magic intercepts, indicating that a significant new military build-up was taking place in Southeast Asia. For Hull, this was a clear sign of Japanese deception. How could Connye's outreach be genuine, with the promise to withdraw troops from Indochina if their military was preparing for war? Sharing his concerns with Roosevelt, the president's earlier optimism completely vanished, with him and Hull deciding that a meeting with the Japanese would now be impossible, unless an even more explicit guarantee was given that the American demands would be met. However, America's ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, would come to a completely different opinion. Grew was considered a legend in the State Department, having served as a diplomat for nearly 40 years and in 14 different posts, with St. Petersburg and Berlin being amongst them. Having great affection for Japan, as well as his wife both speaking Japanese and being a descendant of Matthew Perry, the US Commodore who had commanded the Black Ships nearly a century ago, Grew was considered the best choice for ambassador to Japan when conflict broke out in Manchuria in 1931. Having been stationed there for now nearly a decade, Grew had come to develop a deep understanding of both the complexities of the Japanese system, as well as the thoughts and desires of those in key leadership positions.
The Japanese are not easy to know. I've lived among them for 10 years. You cannot measure Japanese sense of logic by any Western yardstick.
With the Americans having yet again dismissed Japan's attempts to have a face-to-face meeting, army leaders began to grow increasingly agitated, with even the emperor himself now urging for a diplomatic solution to be the nation's top priority. As a result, Cogniet would meet with Grew in person and attempt to resolve their differences. What about Hull's 4 principles? Grew would ask the Prime Minister. They were generally acceptable, Cogniet replied. However, when it comes to applying them practically, various problems will arise, and to solve them, I must have a meeting with the President. Although Cogniet was unable to reveal it to Grew, the deadline the military had set him to complete negotiations was only a month away, and he understood that at this point, using regular diplomatic channels would simply be far too slow, and so urged again that a face-to-face meeting was vital if they were to settle their differences. A year from now, I am not sure that anything can be done to solve our differences, Cogniet stated, but I can do now. I promise that some agreement can be reached if I can only see him. I'll offer him a proposal which he can't afford to reject. Grew believed Cogniet's plea to meet with the President was sincere, and the fact that the Prime Minister had agreed to abide by Hull's 4 principles gave Grew the sense that Cogniet was genuine in his attempts to bring hostilities to an end via diplomatic means. As a result, Grew told Cogniet that he would go back to the embassy immediately and send his message to Washington, something he touted as the most important cable of his diplomatic career. The ambassador stresses the importance of understanding Japanese psychology, fundamentally unlike that of any Western nation. Japanese reactions to any particular set of circumstances cannot be measured, nor can Japanese actions be predicted by any Western measuring rod. Should the United States expect or await agreement by the Japanese government in the present preliminary conversations to clear-cut commitments which will satisfy the United States government, both as to principle and as to concrete detail, almost certainly the conversations will drag along indefinitely and unproductively, until the Cogniet cabinet and its supporting elements, desiring rapprochement with the United States, will come to the conclusion that the outlook for an agreement is hopeless, and that the United States government is only playing for time. This will result in the Cogniet's government being discredited, and in a revulsion of anti-American feeling, and this may, and probably, will lead to unbridled acts. Despite Grew's message, however, Hull and the American leadership had already largely made up their minds, dismissing his cable as the concerns of an ambassador who had grown too close to Japan. Therefore, rather than following Grew's advice, Hull would respond to Cogniet, and rather than clarifying or softening his terms, would instead ask for a concession that was almost certain to guarantee war. All Japanese troops, he demanded, must be completely withdrawn from China without delay if a meeting between Cogniet and Roosevelt was to be arranged. Having received the response, Cogniet would gather the top officials from across the nation to discuss the issue at his villa in Okikubo. But the army, to little surprise, were infuriated by Hull's demands. For them, the American position was now clear. To demand such concessions without a meeting even taking place meant only one thing. It appeared as though they were only trying to buy time, with every sincere Japanese outreach to meet a settlement either being met with mockery or complete dismissal. Attempting to move negotiations forward, Foreign Minister Teijiro Toyoda would speak first. I think the thorniest issue today is the presence of troops in China, and if the army won't concede a thing to the United States, then there's no point in continuing the talks. But if the army can see its way clear to making some slight compromise, it may not be impossible. Furious, War Minister Tojo would respond immediately. The stationing of troops is a matter of life and death to the army. No concessions in that direction. Japan had already agreed, in principle, to the withdrawal of all troops from China, he continued. That in itself was a tremendous concession. Now it was obvious that America was demanding that Japan withdraw all troops at once. This was impossible. 1 million Japanese were still locked in battle in China. Japan could not withdraw completely until order was restored in China. The interior was a hotbed of communists and bandits, and only the presence of Japanese troops in certain areas could guarantee law and order and the successful economic growth of that whole part of the continent. Total withdrawal before the aims of war had been accomplished would not be in keeping with the dignity of the army, and the entire general staff, as well as the troops abroad, agreed with him. Why not give in to America in form, Corneille replied. That is, agree in principle to withdraw all troops, yet make an arrangement with China to retain some troops in unstable areas. That would not be tenable, said Tojo. If they made the pledge to withdraw all troops from the region, they would have to honor their word. And not only this, but if they gave in to American demands, China would see Japan as weak, and soon uprisings could spring up not only in China but Korea as well. Despite being the only man present arguing for war, Tojo refused to back down. I don't think there is any possible way to settle the problem by diplomacy at this stage, he would state. Corneille, however, held the complete opposite opinion, believing that war with the US was futile, and that a meeting with Roosevelt was still Japan's best option. I'm not confident of victory in war, he stated. I think there is no way to overcome the present difficulties except by diplomatic negotiations. Tojo's forceful remarks would continue throughout the afternoon, until finally the men assembled would reach a decision. Corneille would have until October 15th, a 5-day extension, to finish negotiations with the United States, but the army, under no circumstances, would concede anything on the removal of their troops from China. However, while Corneille had initially approved of the compromise, he would come to regret it almost immediately. The removal of troops from China appeared to be the only thing the Americans were interested in, and without this vital bargaining chip, he was unlikely to be able to come to any sort of agreement with Roosevelt. Phoning Tojo on October 14th, one day before the deadline was due, he would plead with the War Minister to reconsider. I can go along with you except for your stand on our troops in China, he would state. But Tojo's reply was swift and uncompromising. If once we give in, the United States will assume a high-handed attitude and keep on acting that way. Your solution is really not a solution. War will crop up again in a few years. I respect you, Mr. Prime Minister, but your view is too pessimistic. You know our weak points too well. America has her weaknesses too. That same day, the cabinet assembled yet again to discuss the issue of China. The army will continue its preparations, said Tojo. I don't mean this will necessarily interfere with the negotiations, but I will not consider another day's delay. However, Foreign Minister Toyoda would state that it was paramount that they give the US a clear and straightforward response. America is becoming more and more suspicious of our attitude, so we can't satisfy them unless we give them facts. They cannot understand Japan's way of carrying on peace talks while preparing for war. Tojo, however, refused to give any ground, this time shouting, I make no concessions regarding withdrawal. It means defeat of Japan by the United States, a stain on the history of the Japanese Empire. The way of diplomacy isn't always a matter of concession. Sometimes it is oppression. If we concede, Manchuria and Korea will be lost. Tojo's outburst had stunned the cabinet into silence, shocked that the War Minister had expressed such a forceful opinion. It left Corneille with very few options. The War Minister's refusal to concede on the matter of China meant that negotiations with the US were now impossible. Continuing as Prime Minister would force Corneille down the path of war, and as such, he saw no option but to resign. Corneille's decision was a deadly blow for those in Japan who still wanted peace. Even generals in the army were alarmed at the prince's resignation. General Muto, although believing Corneille to be a coward, thought he was the only man capable of maintaining national unity, with his absence guaranteeing division and infighting. If he resigns, the general stated, Japan cannot fight a war. However, to the dismay of many in the government, Corneille's resignation would come sooner than expected. On October 16th, he would inform Koichi Kido, the emperor's chief advisor, of his resignation. with the choice of his successor now on everybody's mind. Both the new Prime Minister and the cabinet would be the most consequential and important one to date, with the responsibility to assemble a government capable of bringing about peace, now falling on Kido's shoulders. Known as a calculating and pragmatic man, Kido, just like the Emperor, supported diplomacy and international cooperation, believing that a war with the West would spell disaster for Japan. With tradition dictating that the Emperor was unable to become directly involved in politics, Kido would act as his representative, expressing Hirohito's wishes during imperial conferences and helping to guide the government from behind the scenes. Wishing to avoid war, but also recognizing the need to keep the military under control, Kido was left with few options when appointing the new Prime Minister. To handle this delicate situation, Kido believed it would have to be somebody already familiar with the negotiations, and also someone respected enough for both the government and army to follow their wishes. This left Kido with only two options: Navy Minister Admiral Koshiro Oikawa and War Minister Hideki Tojo. Oikawa was a promising candidate, having already shown signs of favouring a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Despite this, however, Kido didn't believe that Oikawa commanded the respect of the fanatical young officers who constantly threatened to take military action against the government. Despite Tojo being the main opponent to peace up until this point, only he, Kido believed, would control these dangerous military elements and prevent them from rebelling if peace was ultimately favoured over war. He also thought that Tojo was a man of honour, with few political ambitions and a deep admiration for hierarchy, something that could be exploited if he were to get the Emperor to intervene and direct the Prime Minister toward a path of peace. It was a dangerous gamble, but one Kido was willing to take. And so, with the blessing of the Jushin, a council of Japan's 7 former Prime Ministers, Tojo would be appointed as Prime Minister on October 16th. Unlike previous Prime Ministers, however, Tojo would also retain the role of War Minister, combining the two roles into one. Apart from the Emperor, he was now the most powerful man in the nation, presiding over both the government and military, with the power of both branches having been consolidated into his hands.
And the one man who could satisfy Japan's powerful war party, General Hideki Tojo, became Prime Minister. Into office with him in October 1941, General Tojo brought faithful admirals and generals who had served the war party. The removal of Premier Konoye in favor of Tojo meant that the great decision had been made. Japan was setting out irrevocably upon its path of conquest in the Pacific.
The Americans, by seeking to delay negotiations for as long as possible, had inadvertently removed Prince Konoye, the man best suited to achieving peace. In his place was now Hideki Tojo, not only a man that lacked the diplomatic expertise of his predecessor, but had consolidated the power of the War Minister and Prime Minister into one position. The American strategy had seemingly backfired, with Gru's warnings having come to fruition. A growing conflict in Asia was now more likely than ever. However, there remained one last chance for peace. Kido, still intent on reaching a diplomatic solution, would now implement a plan that he had formulated when he had suggested Tojo for the position. Knowing that Tojo was a devout follower of the imperial system and would obey an order from the Emperor no matter the cost, Kido would now look to use this to his advantage, taking an unprecedented action that had never been seen before. The Emperor, a divine figure who tradition dictated remained above politics, was now to intervene directly and order that his government was to prioritize diplomatic efforts. Despite all odds favoring war, there were still those in Japan who favored a peaceful resolution. Having conferred with Hirohito, Kido would then speak to Tojo after his appointment to Prime Minister, where he would relay a direct message from the Emperor. It is His Majesty's wish, Kido stated, that Tojo go back to blank paper, ignore the previous deadline that had been set, and make every effort to renew negotiations with America in the pursuit of peace. It was an unprecedented move. Never in Japanese history had the Emperor overruled a decision of an imperial conference and intervened so forcefully in the affairs of government. Tojo, having a deep admiration and respect for the emperor, bowed to his wishes and stated he would pursue a diplomatic solution. It appeared, for now, that Kido's plan had worked. Having been directed to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis, Tojo would now appoint a new foreign minister to direct negotiations. The man he chose would be Shigenori Togo, an experienced politician who had an excellent understanding of Western culture, having even caused a scandal in Japan by marrying a German woman. Pragmatic to the core, Togo was often blunt and direct to the point, but always wished to negotiate in good faith, with him soon drafting 2 proposals that he thought the United States and Japan could agree upon. Proposal A stipulated that Japan would bring the war with China to an end and they would remove all troops from the country by 1966. If Proposal A was rejected, a fallback position, Proposal B, would then be offered, which would give even more concessions and aim to assure Hull that Japan was no longer interested in pursuing military expansion in Southeast Asia. This proposal stated that there would be no further expansion to the South or Pacific and agreed to an immediate withdrawal of troops from southern Indochina, with their remaining forces stationed there to be removed once the war with China had come to an end. In return for these significant concessions, the United States were to unfreeze Japanese assets and lift the oil embargo that was strangling the Japanese economy and military. However, when Togo presented his proposals during the Imperial Conference of November 1st, he would come across stubborn resistance. The army's highest-ranking officer, General Hajime Sugiyama, would be the first to voice his objections. Stationing troops in French Indochina keeps China under control and also enables us to get raw materials in the south on a 50-50 basis. Moreover, it places us in a stronger position strategically towards the United States, as well as in settling the China incident. Coming to an agreement with the United States doesn't mean they will give us materials. We are against Proposal B. The only alternative Sugiyama proposed was to insist that Hull unfreeze their assets without offering any concessions at all, a suggestion so ridiculous that Togo began to lose his temper. "You're putting me in a difficult position if you tell me to do something that can't be done." Things got so heated that a brief recess was called, with Prime Minister Tojo speaking to the military men privately to remind them of their duty to their emperor. The emperor had asked for blank paper, he stated. We must follow his wishes and bring about a diplomatic solution if possible. It was only now, with the emperor's wishes being evoked, that the army would concede, with Sugiyama reluctantly giving his approval for proposals A and B. For the military, it was a huge concession, one that threatened to cause discontent with the rebellious young officers and breed resentment throughout their ranks. However, the deal was done, but it had come at the cost of one stipulation. A new and final deadline had been set, December 1st. If Togo couldn't reach an agreement by this date, then war with the United States would commence. For Foreign Minister Togo, the delicate task of delivering his proposals to the Americans would now be left in the hands of the Japanese ambassador in Washington, Kichisaburo Nomura. Being good-natured and straightforward, Nomura had been a career naval officer, rising to the rank of admiral before becoming the Japanese ambassador to the United States in 1940. It was his belief that war with America would be disastrous for Japan, and he would do everything in his power to make sure such an outcome did not occur. Despite his good intentions, however, Nomura was prone to diplomatic blunders and had failed to make any significant progress while negotiating with Hull. As such, Togo would now send a special envoy to assist him, Saburo Kurusu. Kurusu was considered a confident and reliable diplomat, having signed the Tripartite Pact on Japan's behalf, while also having a good understanding of Western culture and customs, with his own wife being an American of British descent. Sharing Nomura's conviction that war with the United States should be avoided at all costs, if anybody from Japan was to secure peace, it would be these two who could do it.
On November 14th, Mr. Kurusu arrived in San Francisco.
You all know how difficult my mission is, but I'll do all I can to make it a successful one for the sake of 2 countries, Japan and the United States.
Despite this, however, their path to a negotiated peace would be more difficult than they had imagined. Alongside Roosevelt and Hull, they would also have to deal with Dr. Stanley Hornbeck, Hull's chief advisor on the Far East. Having grown up in China, Hornbeck retained a deep distrust of the Japanese, believing they were a predatory power run by arrogant militarists. Convinced that it was a moral duty of a larger power like the United States to curb Japanese aggression, he was a strong advocate of economic sanctions, believing their use was necessary even if it resulted in war. Another American overseeing negotiations would be Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Having previously served as Secretary of State under President Hoover, Stimson had opposed Japanese expansionism since their invasion of Manchuria, a policy known as the Stimson Doctrine. Ever since, he had worked to build up America's forces in the Pacific, and was yet another advocate of the economic sanctions and oil embargo that Roosevelt had placed on Japan. Although these men, along with many others in the American camp, remained deeply hostile and suspicious of any Japanese concessions, there would still be one man who passionately tried to warn them of the significance of Togo's proposals they were about to receive. Being stationed in Japan, Ambassador Grew had witnessed the growing tensions amongst the Japanese leadership firsthand, and saw that they were growing increasingly frustrated with America's dismissive attitude at their attempts to negotiate. As he noted in his diary in early November, Japan is obviously preparing a program of war to be carried out if her alternative program of peace should fail. Resort to the former may come with dramatic and dangerous suddenness. Realizing that war was closer than ever, he would send a cable to Washington, trying to convey the severity of the situation. If these efforts fail, the ambassador foresees a probable swing of the pendulum in Japan once more back to the former Japanese position or even farther. This would lead to what he has described as an all-out do-or-die attempt, actually risking national harikiri to make Japan impervious to economic embargoes abroad, rather than to yield to foreign pressure. Grew would not be alone in his dire assessment of the situation, with Otto Talicious providing American readers with the events from the Japanese perspective and just how close to war they really were, as he wrote in the New York Times. The Japanese listened to alarming statements by the highest government officials about the greatest crisis Japan has ever faced in her 2,600-year history. They are called to mass meetings to hear denunciations of the enemy, and they read a steady clamour in the press. They see shelters and water reservoirs being built everywhere in preparation for air raids. They are being drilled in air raid defense, especially in fighting fires, the biggest dread of Japanese cities. Finally, they see taxes and prices rising. They know that all these things are not done for fun, and that war, real war, which only a short while ago seemed so far away, is rapidly stretching out its fiery arms towards Nippon, land of the gods. The people do not want war, but neither do they want to give up the fruits of the war they have been fighting, which has cost them such a lot of blood and treasure. They have been told that this war is a war of self-defense, to obtain elbow room for the Japanese people, crowded into a few small islands with few natural resources, and to liberate 1,000 million of Oriental peoples from exploitation by the white race. However, neither articles like this nor Grew's first-hand assessment of the situation would be taken seriously. Stanley Hornbeck, Hull's chief advisor, would dismiss Grew's message entirely, believing him to be gullible, with his love for Japan blinding him to their true intentions. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, his advisors thought they knew better than the man stationed on the ground in Japan. Not only this, but Hornbeck and other members of the American leadership had been receiving an increasing number of messages from their magic intercepts of Japan's diplomatic messages, indicating that they were still preparing for war, despite the claims that they wanted peace. As such, American diplomats were becoming increasingly harsh in their responses to the Japanese, believing that the magic intercepts they were presented with contained all the information they needed to know. However, not only did these intercepts not provide the full context of the conversations between Japanese high command, but they were also badly translated, often changing their entire meaning. In this example, as highlighted by historian John Tolland, Foreign Minister Togo would send a confidential message to Ambassador Nomura, outlining proposals A and B, and stressing the importance of negotiations. Strenuous efforts are being made day and night to adjust Japanese-American relations, which are on the verge of rupture. When this message was intercepted and delivered to Hull, however, the translation would have a much more negative tone. Well, the relations between Japan and the United States have reached their edge, and our people are losing confidence in the possibility of ever adjusting them. This would continue again and again, with Hull and others in the State Department reading translations with a far different meaning than had been intended. For some historians, this point would become a contentious issue, with some attributing it purely to inexperienced and poorly trained translators, while others, mainly in Japan, believed that these and many other diplomatic messages were purposefully mistranslated. When Ambassador Nomura met with Hull on November 7th to present him with Proposal A, Hull, having read through the magic intercepts of the same text over the past several days, would dismiss it entirely, skimming through the pages with haste, having already made up his mind that the proposal offered very few concessions. Although Hull did little to hide his animosity towards the Japanese, he was still careful not to break off negotiations entirely. The American Chiefs of Staff, General Marshall and Admiral Stark, were both insistent on delaying war with Japan for as long as possible, as they would warn President Roosevelt a war with Japan could seriously hinder the Allied struggle against Germany, and that no ultimatum should be given to the Japanese for at least 4 months in order to build up American forces in the Pacific. A week after Hull had been given Proposal A, Special Envoy Kurusu would finally arrive in Washington to assist Nomura with the negotiations, with the pair now presenting Hull with Proposal B, which contained the most significant concessions to date. Upon seeing Kurusu, however, Hull was immediately distrustful. The envoy, he knew, had signed the Tripartite Pact, a document he viewed as both antagonistic and hostile, and beyond that, he simply disliked Kurusu, later writing in his memoirs, "Neither his appearance nor his attitude commanded confidence or respect. I felt from the start that he was deceitful. His only recommendation in my eyes was that he spoke excellent English, having married his American secretary. He was sure that Kurusu's only objective was to lull us with talk until the moment Japan got ready to strike." And so, when Hull was presented with Proposal B, he was not only dismissive, but even began to lose his temper, writing in his memoirs that their proposals were of so preposterous a character that no American official could ever have dreamed of accepting them. To Nomura and Kurusu, the concessions outlined in Proposal B had come at great difficulty, with their emperor himself having intervened to make sure they had come to pass. The military too had given far more ground than their honour allowed, even risking a coup from the young officers by pledging to remove troops from southern Indochina. For Hull, however, he viewed the concessions as simply another attempt of Japanese duplicity. It was not really a question of Proposal B itself, but of State Department refusal to accept it at face value. What the Japanese army considered a major concession and had accepted only after bitter arguments, withdrawal of troops from southern Indochina to the north, was scorned. It was a meaningless offer, since the Japanese could easily return the same troops to southern Indochina within a day or two. Despite having no intentions of ever accepting the terms, Hull would decide to abide by the wishes of the American Chiefs of Staff to string along the Japanese for as long as possible, telling the two diplomats that he would give the proposal, quote, sympathetic study. This would, in Hull's words, avoid giving the Japanese any pretext to walk out of the conversations. Despite Hull's pessimism, Roosevelt, however, would view Proposal B in a more favourable light, believing it offered a glimpse of hope for negotiations. Agreeing with the Chiefs of Staff that war should be avoided for as long as possible, he would draft a modus vivendi, a temporary agreement, and send it to Hull, outlining a potential response that could reopen negotiations. For the next 6 months, it would state the US would resume a limited amount of oil and rice trade to Japan. In exchange, the Japanese would refrain from sending any further troops into Indochina, the Manchurian border, or the European colonies to the south. The Japanese would also have to pledge that they would not go to war under the Tripartite Pact if the United States decided to declare war against Germany. And finally, the United States would act as a mediator between China and Japan to help bring the war to an end. Upon receiving Roosevelt's note, Hull, despite his reservations, would make plans to move ahead with negotiations, taking the modus vivendi to the Allied powers for their approval. Upon doing so, however, he would come up against great opposition from the Chinese, with their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, stating that this was an indication that the US, was inclined to appease Japan at the expense of China. Churchill too believed there were not enough guarantees for China, as he would cable to Roosevelt. "Of course, it is for you to handle this business, and we certainly do not want an additional war. There is only one point that disquiets us. What about Chiang Kai-shek? Is he not having a very thin diet? Our anxiety is about China. If they collapse, our joint dangers would enormously increase." The objections of the Chinese and British would be enough to convince Hull that a tougher stance on Japan was needed. Not only this, but a new magic intercept would soon be delivered to him, detailing a conversation between Tokyo and Nomura.
November 26, Washington. A decoded message from Tokyo is prepared for the State Department. Urgent to both you ambassadors. There must be an agreement by November 29th. This time we mean it. The deadline absolutely cannot be changed. After that, things are automatically going to happen. For Hull and Undersecretary Sumner Wells, the crisis deepens, but there will be no appeasement.
Sharing the message with Roosevelt and Stimson, all three men would take it as confirmation that war was inevitable, with Stimson writing in his diary, "Roosevelt brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps next Monday, December 1st. For the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. It was a difficult proposition." The following day, with his allies not receptive to the proposals and believing a Japanese attack was imminent, Hull would abandon Roosevelt's modus vivendi altogether, instead drafting a far harsher response. But notably, he would do this without consulting General Marshall or Admiral Stark, who still desired for negotiations to be prolonged. Known as the 10-point demand, he would present it to Ambassador Kurusu and Nomura on November 26, with it demanding that Japan withdraw all military, naval, air and police forces from China and Indochina, support no other government or regime in China except for Chiang Kai-shek's, and in exchange, the United States would unfreeze all Japanese assets. Even with these concessions being demanded of the Japanese, Hull had still failed to address the biggest issue they faced, the oil embargo. Upon reading Hull's note, the Japanese ambassadors were shocked. The note was effectively a declaration of war. There was no chance those in Tokyo, even those who sought peace, would ever agree to an immediate withdrawal of all troops from China, a move that would surely lead to the collapse of everything the Japanese had worked so hard to gain over the past decade. Knowing what the response would be back home, Kurusu would attempt to reason with Hull. Negotiations would be impossible, he would state, if it expected Japan to take off its hat to Chiang Kai-shek and apologize to him. Surely some other compromise could be reached. "It is as far as we can go," Hull would reply. There was nothing more to be done. The note was sent back to Tokyo. With the negotiations with Japan seemingly having come to an end, an urgent alert was sent to the commanders in the Far East, including General Douglas MacArthur, who was stationed in the Philippines, which read the following: "Negotiations with the Japanese appear to be terminated to all practical purposes, with only the barest possibilities that the Japanese government might come back and offer to continue. Japanese future action unpredictable, but hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense." The road to war had been set, and a conflict in the Pacific was soon to come to fruition. Receiving Hull's 10-point demand the next day on November 27th, the response would be read aloud by Prime Minister Tojo in a meeting of Japan's top government and military officials. As Tojo finished reading the note, the room fell silent in disbelief. "This is an ultimatum," one man would shout, with another, Admiral Shimada, declaring Hull's note to be a jarring blow, as well as unyielding and unbending in its failure to acknowledge any of the concessions that had taken such great effort to achieve. The most egregious point would be Hull's demand for an immediate withdrawal from China. Although Hull had intended this point not to include Manchuria, The wording of his response left this incredibly ambiguous, with the Japanese, assuming he was demanding they abandon the territory they had won all the way back in 1932. The loss of Manchuria would spell economic disaster for Japan, considering the amount of time and resources they had poured into the region, let alone the blood they had spilt to claim it. From the Japanese perspective, Hull's note was clearly designed to be impossible to accept, yet another stalling tactic to entice Japan into striking the first blow. America had made up her mind and was ready to go to war. The negotiations they had earnestly thought would bring about peace had been in vain. From the Japanese perspective, America had simply been stalling for time. On December 1st, 1941, with the deadline having finally been reached, Emperor Hirohito would comply with the wishes of his military and government, and conceded to declaring war on the United States. Following in Japan's historic tradition of surprise attacks, a plan, months in the making, would now be put underway to begin the war by striking at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. With Japan now on the path to war, their hopes of success would lie on the shoulders of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a highly gifted naval officer and commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. However, when Yamamoto had assumed his position as head of the Japanese naval forces, he had found the existing plan for war against the United States to be completely inadequate. Japan's admirals had been expecting the Americans to launch an all-out attack on their fleet close to the home islands, with a decisive battle then culminating in Japanese waters, where their navy reigned supreme. Much like the decisive battles of the past, such as when the legendary Admiral Togo had wiped out the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, it would be this coming battle, just off the coast of Japan, that would bring about the victory they had hoped for. However, this strategy Yamamoto believed was reactive and relied too heavily on the United States to make the first move. Instead, upon taking command of the Japanese Combined Fleet, he would look for a different strategy, drawing upon his knowledge of modern naval warfare. Having spent many years in America, studying at Harvard University and acting as a naval diplomat in Washington, Yamamoto was well aware of the vast industrial potential the United States possessed, which would undoubtedly overwhelm Japan if a prolonged conflict was to break out. As such, he was an open critic of war with the United States, a stance that put him in danger of assassination by fanatical army ultranationalists, with him warning Prime Minister Connolly in 1941. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. When war seemed all but inevitable, however, Yamamoto would reluctantly take on responsibility for planning the attack. A natural risk-taker, he was known as an expert gambler, being proficient in games of luck and strategy, such as poker, bridge, shogi, and go. As such, he was willing to risk everything in one daring attack that was aimed at wiping out the American fleet before the conflict even began. Taking inspiration from his hero, the legendary Admiral Togo, whom Yamamoto had served under 35 years ago during the Russo-Japanese War, he would now look to launch a surprise attack of his own, just like Togo had done all those years ago that had successfully crippled the Russian fleet. This time, however, it would not be the Russians that were his target, but the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto also believed that it was vital to destroy America's aircraft carriers in the attack, as he saw them as being the true heart of a modern navy, as opposed to battleships, as many of his contemporaries still believed. Removing America's aircraft carriers now would give Japan the best chance it had to secure domination over the Pacific. Along with the importance of taking out the American carriers, attacking Pearl Harbor would also open up the way for Japanese conquests to the south. With negotiations with the US having failed, they were now desperate to acquire a new source of oil, with the Dutch East Indies and their plentiful oil fields now ripe for the taking. However, the flow of these resources back to Japan could still be disrupted by American forces in the Philippines, with the neutralization of this American outpost a necessity if their plan was to be successful. The Philippines, however, would prove difficult to take. Not only was it an important American base under the command of renowned General Douglas MacArthur, but if war was to break out, it could be supplied and reinforced with troops and ships from Pearl Harbor. Taking out Pearl Harbor, therefore, would be a top priority, as it would leave the Philippines isolated and exposed for the taking. The attack Yamamoto hoped would therefore give Japan time, around 6 months, to seize the Dutch East Indies and secure control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific without American interference. During this time, Japan could also begin construction of new battleships and aircraft carriers, increasing its presence and naval might in the region. With the Pacific securely under Japanese control and the American fleet having been completely wiped out, they would now be able to establish a defensive perimeter, something they referred to as the Absolute National Defense Zone, a vertical line that stretched from western New Guinea to the Kuril Islands north of mainland Japan. The territory within this zone would be referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and would ensure that the Japanese could transport the vital resources of oil, tin and rubber from their conquests back to the homeland without interference from the Western powers. If all went according to plan, and with their power now uncontested across the region, Yamamoto believed that the United States would be forced to accept Japanese dominance in East Asia, with a prolonged conflict between the two nations becoming an unthinkable idea. Japan was to be so strong and well positioned that the Americans would be foolish even to consider war. Pearl Harbor itself was stationed in Hawaii, an American territory in the Pacific that was a vital part of US defense in the region due to its central location and proximity to Asia, acting as a potential buffer against Japanese expansionism. Its deep water harbor, extensive repair facilities, and ample supplies made it an ideal location for the American Navy to station its fleet, with the base also serving as a vital hub for communications and intelligence gathering. As such, the base at Pearl Harbor was home to a majority of the US Pacific Fleet, including 3 carriers, 8 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 30 destroyers, with it acting as a forward operating base for projecting American power into the region. Pearl Harbor itself was stationed on the central island of Oahu, located just west of the capital city of Honolulu. Although home to around 40,000 military personnel, peacetime liberties had been granted, with the men stationed there making use of the many luxuries the tropical island provided. This relaxed atmosphere, however, would be something the Japanese looked to exploit, with Admiral Yamamoto sending a spy, Takeo Yoshikawa, on a reconnaissance mission to infiltrate the island and gather as much vital information as possible. Disguising himself as a tourist, wearing sunglasses and a bright Hawaiian shirt, Yoshikawa would drive around the island twice a week and visit Pearl Harbor every day, memorizing the length of the main runways, as well as the numbers of planes, pilots, hangars and soldiers, delivering all of this information back to Tokyo. The security on the island was so lax, in fact, that Yoshikawa was able to infiltrate the American naval base several times, even managing to scuba dive underneath the harbor to check the integrity of the torpedo nets that protected the ships stationed there. Once armed with a lunchbox, he followed a group of laborers and spent the day wandering around without being questioned. He tapped a big oil tank to see how much was inside, and discovered that full tanks usually leaked and could easily be detected from outside the fence. With the essential information Yoshikawa provided now in Yamamoto's hands, he was able to finalize his plans for the attack. By April, Yamamoto's plan to attack Pearl Harbor would be officially named Operation Z, a name he had chosen in honor of a famous message, known as the Z signal, that Admiral Togo had conveyed to his men before the Battle of Tsushima. On this one battle rests the fate of our nation. Let every man do his utmost. The upcoming attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto believed, would be of equal significance. The fate of Japan hung in the balance. For the attack itself, Yamamoto planned to use aircraft carriers to strike the American base, at a time when most Japanese admirals still favored traditional naval engagements, using battleships and other surface vessels in head-to-head combat. Yamamoto was one of the first to recognize the strength of modern naval aviation, the use of planes at sea, funding and promoting the construction of a fleet of 10 aircraft carriers by 1941, each of which could launch over 50 aircraft. The employment of these carriers would make the entire operation possible, allowing the Japanese to launch a devastating air raid against Pearl Harbor, all while keeping their own ships at a distance, safe from retaliation. As such, a strike force of 6 carriers would be created to carry out the mission, known as the Kido Butai, with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to serve as its commander. A seasoned admiral and skilled tactician, Yamamoto hoped he would have the experience to execute such a complex operation. With the commander now selected, Yamamoto and his team could turn their attention towards tackling 2 significant problems that Operation Z would have to overcome. The first would be maintaining the element of surprise, as approaching Hawaii by traditional routes would expose the strike force to discovery by American patrols and end the operation before it even began. The second problem would be that the Japanese carriers did not have enough fuel capacity to make the journey in one trip, meaning that they would have to be refueled at some point along the route without being discovered. After much discussion, a plan was finally formed that looked to solve both of these problems. The Kido Butai was to head to an unexpected and unpatrolled part of the ocean, 800 miles north of Hawaii, which would be out of range of American reconnaissance. And with the Americans expecting that any attack on Pearl Harbor would likely come from the Marshall Islands to the west, an attack from this direction would take them by complete surprise. Being accompanied by specialized fuel ships, the carriers could also solve their second problem by refueling along the way, before continuing their journey to Pearl Harbor in complete radio silence to avoid detection. While taking out the American fleet at Pearl Harbor was essential, the true prize were the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, with a simultaneous assault to take place against the Philippines that morning, alongside Malaya, Guam, Wake, Hong Kong and Singapore, with the exact timing of these attacks to be essential if secrecy was to be maintained. It was to be a surprise attack of epic proportions. No longer would the Japanese have to succumb to the whims and demands of the European colonial powers. It would be an Asian continent controlled by Asians, with the Japanese seeing themselves not as conquerors, but rather as liberators of the Asian people. With the plan now set, the Kido Butai would be dispatched on November 26, the very day that the Japanese received Hull's final note, which they perceived as little more than a complete declaration of war. The crew aboard the carriers, having been kept in the dark up until this point, would be informed for the first time that their target was to be Pearl Harbor, with a great cheer erupting amongst the young men, for whom many this would be the first real combat they would get to engage in. Moving in radio silence, the ships would turn off all lights to travel in complete blackout, with them also taking another serious precaution, changing the Japanese fleet code. This would completely neutralize the American codebreakers, who would now be unable to decipher their messages, leaving both their plan of attack and whereabouts to complete mystery. One thing was now for certain: wherever the Japanese decided to attack, the Americans would not see it coming. With the Kido Butai nearing their target, the Americans would begin to prepare for a Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific, but where that was still anyone's guess. The British had noted a significant build-up of Japanese naval forces near the Malay Peninsula, with them relaying this information to Washington DC on December 6. Upon hearing the news, during a meeting of the American naval leadership, Navy Secretary Frank Knox would ask, "Gentlemen, are they going to hit us?" "No, Mr. Secretary," Rear Admiral Turner would reply. "They are going to hit the British. They are not ready for us yet." It was a sentiment shared by much of the American military, who believed Japan to be either unwilling or incapable of making an attack against them. If the Japanese did dare to make an attack, most thought the Philippines was the most likely target, with there being almost no one who seriously believed that Pearl Harbor was in any sort of danger. This would be reflected in a message sent to General Walter C. Short, the American Army commander responsible for Pearl Harbor. The message warned him that the Japanese were likely to strike somewhere in the Pacific, but had no indication that Pearl Harbor itself would be a possible target, instead ordering him not to take any actions that were likely to cause panic amongst the civilian population. As a result, Short believed the most serious threat Pearl Harbor faced was sabotage from the 160,000 Hawaiian residents of Japanese ancestry. To mitigate this threat, the island's planes were clustered together on the runways so they could be more closely guarded, and military supplies, such as anti-aircraft rounds, were locked away to prevent sabotage. To reinforce the security of American outposts, he would send 2 of the 3 US Pacific-based aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor to Wake and Midway Island, delivering support aircraft and reinforcements. The 3rd carrier, the Saratoga, was undergoing maintenance back on the west coast of the United States at the time. This would mean that the entire US carrier force, the key target of Yamamoto's operation, would now be absent at the time of the attack. The Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. The attackers achieved complete surprise, with almost every American who looked up to the sky and saw the Japanese planes, assuming they were friendly aircraft engaged in training exercises. But then, the first bombs exploded. Torpedoes specially designed for shallow waters surrounding the port, as well as armor-piercing bombs, which were dropped above the ships, piercing straight through their decks. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the Japanese aerial forces, would message Nagumo, "Tora, Tora, Tora," translating to Tiger, 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 letting his commander know that he had achieved a strategic, operational, and tactical surprise. As more and more planes arrived overhead, one pilot would take this photograph of Battleship Row, showing the American fleet tightly grouped together, making them easy targets for the wave after wave of Japanese torpedo and dive bombers that were to come. Within minutes, the battleships Maryland and Tennessee were each hit, followed by the Arizona, which sank almost instantly. The first Japanese wave consisted of 183 planes, with torpedo bombers attacking the ships and dive bombers simultaneously attacking the airfields, preventing airborne resistance. But, much to their surprise, they found all the US aircraft clustered together, making them an easy target. Short's decision to pack them tightly together to prevent sabotage had proven to be a costly mistake, with the Japanese dive bombers wiping out almost all of their planes. The Americans were also unable to shoot back, as their anti-aircraft ammunition had been locked away to prevent sabotage. Desperate attempts were made to fight back, with men resorting to using their pistols to fire at the bombers as they passed by. After a brief interval, a second wave of 170 Japanese planes appeared, all of which were tasked with finishing off the battleships that were still afloat or only partially damaged. However, the Americans were alert this time and succeeded at shooting down 24 Japanese planes, with only 5 Japanese planes having been shot down in the first attack. 90 minutes later, the attack was over. The Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships and destroyed 188 planes, while damaging 159 others. The attack killed 2,403 US servicemen, with nearly half of them on the US battleship Arizona. It appeared to be a total victory for Japan, who had only lost 29 aircraft during the assault. Admiral Nagumo was concerned sending a third wave would open his carriers up to attack, and so any further strikes were called off, believing sufficient damage had been done. However, although Japanese losses were minuscule, victory was not complete. The US carrier force, Yamamoto's key target, was not at Pearl Harbor, leaving the Americans with one of the most powerful parts of their navy still intact. The attack had also failed to hit American fuel depots and had not destroyed the US submarine base, leaving them with resources with which to rebuild their fleet. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the Japanese Empire, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Pearl Harbor would rally the American people, who were once isolationist, into a furious nation intent on revenge, with Americans from all over the United States flocking to recruitment stations. Far from wiping out American influence in the Pacific, the Japanese had just awoken a sleeping giant. Yamamoto's biggest fear was about to come to fruition. A prolonged war with an industrial superpower was about to begin.